You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
Last year, President Trump formally recognized February as Black History Month, as presidents have done since 1976, when Gerald Ford was the first to do so. Even while he gave lip service to this important commemoration of Black history, his anti-DEI efforts were helping to remove its official observation throughout the federal government. His Department of Defense issued a news release stating that, quote, Identity Months, Black History Month, Women's History Month, National Disability Employment Awareness Month were effectively dead, end quote. In the months to follow, he resumed his crusade against Black history, begun at the end of his first administration with his creation of the 1776 Commission to purposely oppose the New York Times' 1619 Project. And this time, like many of his endeavors during his second term, he approached the project with a vengeance. In the same executive order that took aim at the Smithsonian, he claimed the National Museum of African American History and Culture was distorting history and misrepresenting quote-unquote white culture. The following month, his National Park Service began redacting their exhibits to remove mention of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. This assault on history continues, as just a few days before I wrote this, he had exhibits on slavery removed from the President's House Memorial in Philadelphia, exciting further outrage that was nevertheless drowned out by the continued violence his federal agents are perpetrating against protesters in Minneapolis. This violent militarized response to protest is further connected to his scorn for any who point out the systemic racism in U.S. history, as a clear line can be drawn back to his response to the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder during his first term, when he openly expressed his desire to call the military in and have them shoot protesters. It's hard to imagine that his second-term efforts to deploy military in U.S. cities and claim absolute immunity for federal agents who shoot protesters are unrelated to his feelings about BLM protests in 2020, especially when recent shootings have occurred in the same city where George Floyd was murdered and the protests began. Just as the killing of George Floyd sparked national protests, and before him, Philando Castile, also killed in Minneapolis by police over a firearm that he was licensed to carry, so too have the recent killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy galvanized protests against immigration enforcement and the Trump regime's authoritarian tactics. And as outrage has arisen over the impunity with which federal ICE agents have killed American citizens in the streets, so also has the sentiment among the African American community that this is nothing new. This is the America that Black people have always known. As Langston Hughes said, quote, "We are the people who have long known in actual practice the meaning of the word fascism," end quote. This is historical blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and this February, it's important as an act of resistance to observe Black History Month, and I want to do so first by telling the story of an important Black figure in American history, whose story illustrates that the road to liberty has always been paved over Black bodies. The story of the first American patriot whose killing in the streets sparked a revolution. Thank you for listening to Crispus Attucks, American Martyr. Before we begin, it's time to thank the newest patrons of the podcast. Thanks Elizabeth K. Joseph, Winnie C., and Matt Manning. Thank you to all of my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. After my season premiere on global sacred alignments, I released a minisode all about dowsing and water witching. And after my episode about the failed predictions of American millennialists, I released one on the long history of evangelicals accusing world figures of being the Antichrist, questioning their reluctance now to recognize that Trump fits the bill better than any previous candidate. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. The story of Crispus Attucks starts with the story of resistance against tyranny in colonial America. He was a virtually unknown figure before his death, but the circumstances of his death would eventually lead to his becoming an icon. The circumstances are those that I have spoken about in a couple episodes over the last year. It was a time of great unrest over punishing tariffs, as I spoke about in my episode Tariff Men last summer. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which forced colonists to pay a tax on any printed paper products, which required a stamp proving the tax had been paid. Colonists protested this as taxation without representation. The following year, in an effort to continue taxing the colonies while avoiding such direct taxation, tariffs were imposed on imported paper, as well as paint, glass, lead, and tea under the Townshend Acts, sparking increased protest as colonists recognized that the cost of tariffs is passed on to the consumers, making it just another tax without their consent. They reacted by boycotting imported goods, undertaking smuggling operations, and gathering in the streets to express their discontent to customs officials. British troops were sent to Boston to quell the unrest there, as I described in my episode Standing Army Sitting President last year. And this was no minor military presence. By some estimates, 4,000 troops were quartered there in a city of only about 15,000 residents, such that 1 in every 4 people was a soldier. Beyond their threatening presence while on duty protecting customs officials, they also created tension by seeking further employment in their off-duty hours and thereby taking jobs that might have been given to residents. Inevitably, violent resistance to occupation occurred. Just as we saw with the series of killings that culminated in the 2020 protests against police violence, and today with the series of killings by ICE in Minnesota ratcheting up tensions across the country. The culmination of tensions in Boston came after an initial killing, the murder of Christopher Cedar, an 11-year-old boy who is considered today the first casualty of the American Revolution. In February 1770, a crowd of protesters surrounded the home of one British customs official, throwing rocks at his house. The customs official emerged and shot into the crowd, killing the boy. This killing only worsened the tensions, as the boy's funeral, attended by thousands, further rallied many to resist both taxation and military occupation. Confrontations between soldiers and protesters increased. and there's some evidence that British soldiers intended to escalate the violence further, with one record indicating that a soldier's wife, in defending the actions of the soldiers, warned that, quote, before Tuesday or Wednesday night, they would wet their swords or bayonets in New England people's blood, end quote. 2 days later, on March 5th, 1770, the predicted violence erupted. At the Custom House on King Street, a 13-year-old wigmaker's apprentice accused one soldier of not paying a debt owed to his master, and another soldier demanded the boy show the soldier respect and struck the child in the head with his musket. A crowd began to gather and grow angrier and angrier, and as the situation worsened, church bells rang out, usually a signal of a fire. Whether it was intended to sound an alarm about the growing conflict in the streets or to draw more protesters is unclear, but it certainly had the latter effect. As had become common in such demonstrations, these protesters began throwing things at the soldiers: snowballs, oyster shells, sticks, and pressing in on them. One was knocked down and fired his weapon, and someone, perhaps not their captain, shouted at the others to do likewise, which they took as an order and did. 3 residents were killed in the volley of musket fire. Another would die of his wounds within a day, and a 5th within 2 weeks of his injuries. Among the 3 who were killed first and instantly was a man believed to be of mixed race, black and Native American, named Crispus Attucks. The governor was able to restore order and disperse the crowd with promises of a fair investigation into the shootings, but this investigation would only further complicate the affair. It was during this politically charged aftermath that the myths and legends about Crispus Attucks were born. Within a few weeks, the soldiers who had fired on the crowd of protesters, along with some civilians alleged to have fired from inside the Custom House, were indicted for murder. During the months leading up to the trial, a pamphlet war was waged, with loyalist and patriot versions of the events disseminated, such that it was feared the soldiers could not receive a fair trial. For example, an engraver named Henry Pelham immortalized the event in an etching that depicted grinning, malicious soldiers firing in unison and upon an innocent-looking, unarmed crowd. This engraving would be copied by Paul Revere and spread far and wide by that famous spreader of bad news. In fact, Revere is commonly credited with creating the engraving, though this is not the case, as it seems he merely copied it. What's interesting, though, is that the crowd fired on in the picture is depicted as all white, with no sign of racial diversity among them. The figure of Crispus Attucks would only become the face of the protest during the trial, when he was depicted as its leader by future founding father and President John Adams, then a lawyer and staunch opponent of the Stamp Act, who had been convinced to defend the soldiers in court because of concerns over British reprisal if it appeared the trial was unfair. Some of the remarks that Adams made during the trial helped later to develop the conception of Crispus Attucks as a patriotic hero. According to Adams, Attucks marched the whole group of protesters up King Street, wielding clubs, rallying his troops by calling out, "Do not be afraid of them." By Adams's account, Attucks was the one who knocked down the first soldier to shoot, single-handedly, grasping the soldier's bayonet in his bare hand and striking him with his other fist. It is from this narrative Adams crafted that we get the idea of Attucks being the first to be shot. However, despite how this depiction might be appealing in that it can be taken as a display of heroism, in reality, Adams was attempting to lay the blame for the whole massacre on the shoulders of this one fallen black man. Elsewhere during the trial, he suggested the protesters were a, quote, motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jack tars, end quote. In other words, just a bunch of lowly, non-white, and immigrant troublemakers, not even deigning to call them a quote-unquote mob, because in his words, quote, the name is too respectable for them, end quote. In his narrative, merely the fearsome look of Attucks was enough to drive the soldiers to act in self-defense, for the, quote, stout Attucks was enough to terrify any person, end quote. In case his assertion that Crispus Attucks was solely responsible for the violence was unclear, Adams stated very precisely that it was, quote, to Attucks's mad behavior, in all probability, the dreadful carnage of that night is chiefly to be ascribed, end quote. It's from this account that later tellings, both favorable and unfavorable to the memory of Attucks, have it that he led the protesters, that he was armed with a club, that he did violence to the soldiers, and dared them to shoot. But none of this is supported by eyewitness testimony. Previous accounts did not indicate a particular leader, and though they mentioned that protesters were scornfully challenging the soldiers to fire, they did not attribute these defiant shouts to any one participant. And the notion that Attucks was the one who knocked down the soldier who first fired on the protesters is actually contradicted by the testimony of a merchant named Richard Palms, who testified that he had been talking to the captain, warning the soldiers not to fire on the protesters, when a piece of ice struck the soldier, who did not so much fall down as stumble a step backward and fire his gun. In fact, Palms testified that it was he himself, not Attucks, who was holding a cudgel and began striking the soldier after the gunfire had erupted, because they tried to stab him with bayonets. And other witnesses who did remark on the presence of Crispus Attucks testified that he was more than a dozen feet away when the gunfire erupted. Nevertheless, Adams's race-baiting misrepresentation of the protest as being the work of one lawless person of color convinced the jury, who acquitted most of the soldiers and convicted 2 only of manslaughter rather than murder. It seemed they agreed with Adams's argument that, as one historian characterized it, the soldiers had, quote, only killed a black man and his cronies and didn't deserve to hang for it, end quote. One further argument that Adams made was that Crispus Attucks was an outside agitator because he wasn't even from Boston, but rather from Framingham, about 21 miles west of the city. This detail serves as the first real clue about who Crispus Attucks really was, something that historians have been trying to puzzle together for hundreds of years. From the court records, we knew only that he was referred to as a quote-unquote mulatto, and as a quote-unquote Indian. This has led some historians to question whether he was indeed black, because the offensive term mulatto, which was historically used to refer to people with both black and white or European parentage, was also used simply in reference to skin color, and therefore had been used in that time to refer to full-blooded Native Americans. Indeed, the question of Crispus Attucks' blackness continues to be debated as historians slowly learned more about his background. It's now generally accepted that he was a slave belonging to a minister in Framingham who in 1770 advertised in the Boston Gazette that this slave, named Crispus with an A, described as, quote, 6 feet 2 inches high, short curled hair, end quote, had escaped, and that he, this slave-holding deacon, would pay 10 pounds for his capture. Some historians have tried to connect him to a Narragansett man with the surname Attuck, who was hanged around Framingham about 100 years before the Boston Massacre. However, other historians have connected him to a family of slaves with the last name Peter Attucks, who ended up in the Framingham area and sometimes divided their last name into 2 names, such that the last name was Attucks alone. Many of these individuals were separately described in records as quote-unquote Negro. And some who lived in the area and remembered this family specifically refuted in later years the claim that the Attucks family was, quote, of Indian blood, end quote, asserting that they were all of them, including Crispus, whom they remembered as Chris, descended from a black slave named Jacob Peter Attucks, and that, quote, all who knew the descendants described them as Negroes, end quote. So there's good scholarly reason to reject attempts to erase the blackness of Crispus Attucks. According to the records as they have been assembled, Attucks found work on the docks as a stevedore and as a sailor aboard whaling vessels, where he sometimes used the false name Michael Johnson. In fact, at the time of the massacre, it seemed Attucks had only lately returned from the Bahamas and would soon be leaving for North Carolina. This fact further belies the notion that this man, already a second-class citizen and a fugitive who had only been in Boston a short time and was due to leave shortly thereafter, somehow ended up mustering and leading a crusading mob armed only with clubs against a squad of musketeers. But regardless of Crispus Attucks' exact racial heritage and level of involvement in organizing the protest that day, it cannot be denied that he represents perfectly the black experience, having escaped enslavement and dodged slave patrols for 20 years, taking on grueling work to make a living, being shot in the street of a militarized police state, and then afterward being singled out and blamed for the very violence perpetrated against him. Afterward, he was buried alongside the other victims of the massacre in a prominent graveyard where Founding Fathers John Hancock and Samuel Adams would also be buried, but which typically relegated black people to the back of the cemetery, separate from the white people buried there. While in death he was at least awarded this dignity, he would afterward be almost entirely forgotten for more than 60 years. Now for a brief intermission.
You can spend less time staying in the know about all things gaming and get more time to actually play the games you love with the IGN Daily Update podcast. All you need is a few minutes to hear the latest from IGN on the world of video games, movies, and television with news, previews, and reviews. You'll hear everything from Comic-Con coverage to the huge Diablo 4 launch. So listen and subscribe to the IGN Daily Update wherever you get your podcasts. That's the IGN Daily Update, wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, Film Vault.
We are one of the original film podcasts.
That can't be true.
There was like 2 other film podcasts when we began, Brian.
How long have we been doing this show?
You and I first sat down and did a version of the show over 20 years ago.
My God.
There is shtick, but it's very little shtick.
We finish each other's
sandwiches?
close enough.
Was that a joke on a movie?
Yeah, that's from Frozen.
Oh, it is.
Pretty bad.
Ugh.
Oh, look at you.
I don't want to be like quoting Frozen on this promo.
Okay, peek behind the curtain. Anderson's like the Frozen guy. Like, he'll constantly reference animated films, family films, and I'm more the edgy indie guy.
We do have the tropey thing going on where Brian does like the big Hollywood sexy summer movies. I'm always looking for like the hidden gems. 2 episodes each week. One,
we review movies, and the first episode, and the second one, top 5 time. Top 5, different top 5 every week. Movies that made you cry. Worst movie accents. Most disturbing movies. All right, the Film Vault, check it out.
wherever you find podcasts.
That's right, the Film Vault's going on 20 plus years.
Now, back to the show. From 1771 to 1783, the city of Boston held an annual day of commemoration on March 5th, at which national figures and well-known patriots delivered stirring orations designed to keep the memory of the Boston Massacre at the forefront of the young nation's thoughts. Only in one such speech, however, were the names of the fallen uttered, and Crispus Attucks was not celebrated as a leader or as particularly heroic or defiant, nor did the one speech that mentioned him, given by signer of the Declaration of Independence John Hancock, make any mention of his racial heritage. And after 1783, as commemorations tended to be held instead on the 4th of July, Crispus Attucks was all but lost to time, mentioned only briefly in a handful of biographies and history books. It was not until the antebellum period, when the question of black chattel slavery became more and more prominent in the 1830s, that he reappeared in some children's books, which gave kids a pretty detailed recounting of the massacre, presenting Attucks in much the same biased and inaccurate way as Adams had, as a violent black man who had spearheaded the revolt against the Redcoats. But around the same time, his memory started to be reclaimed by African Americans and abolitionists. After 1833, during August 1st commemorations of Emancipation Day, celebrating the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, many abolitionist leaders invoked the memory of the Boston Massacre in arguing for the liberty of all men. But none mentioned Attucks until 1839, when one black minister and activist for abolition, suffrage, and temperance, Jehiel Beeman, declared, quote, that the first blood spilt for independence in this country was by a colored man by the name of Attucks, end quote. It's unclear if the misspelling of the Attucks name in the printed version of his speech was the error of the transcriber or due to Beeman's mispronunciation of the name. Regardless, the name had been uttered and its significance made clear. 2 years later, black historian and abolitionist William Cooper Nell, who had attended Beeman's Emancipation Day speech, wrote to a friend about his research into Attucks, sifting through sources that claimed he had been the, quote, first who fell in liberty's cause, end quote, and remarking on the conflicting claims about his race. Within about 9 years, Nell had done the heavy work of researching a biography of Attucks, including the interviews with those outside Framingham who remembered his family and confirmed his black identity. And he introduced Attucks to the public in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. Over the next 2 years, as abolitionist after abolitionist invoked his memory on stage after stage, Crispus Attucks became one of the most popular examples of black patriotism, embodying the argument for black liberty and citizenship, essentially held up by reformers as a black founding father. In 1851, Nell published Services of Colored Americans in the Wars of 1776 and 1812, followed a few years later by The Colored Patriots of the Revolution, both of which cemented Attucks's place in American history as the, quote, first martyr, end quote, of the American Revolution. In 1856, a new visual representation of the massacre appeared, a copy yet again of the old Pelham engraving in that it depicted the same perspective right down the center of King Street, a line of redcoats discharging their firearms on the right, expelling clouds of smoke, and the victims shot down and falling on the left. But the difference was that right in the center, club in hand and head thrown back as he is shot in the chest, is Crispus Attucks, clearly depicted with a deep brown skin tone. In the 1860s, as the Civil War, or as abolitionists called it, the Slaveholders' War, consumed the lives of so many, Crispus Attucks remained a powerful symbol of the African American struggle for liberty and citizenship. On March 5, 1862, in Boston, a commemoration of the Boston Massacre was observed again as a Crispus Attucks commemoration, and William Cooper Nell delivered a powerful speech. When the authorities of the town of Boston voted to merge the 5th of March celebration into the 4th of July, he declared, it would have been very well and no need for its revival as a special commemoration. had the people not so entirely, from that day to this, forgotten that the colored man was one of the all men created free and equal, and that he had with them shared the dangers of that struggle, which resulted in the severance of the American colonies from the domination of monarchical England." End quote. Attucks remained a powerful symbol for liberation among abolitionists through the end of the war, when the dream of liberation was officially realized, as well as afterward, when they finally achieved citizenship with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. But still, the struggle remained in the Reconstruction period, as white supremacists sought to entrench their social position and re-systematize the subjugation of Black Americans. And so the figure of Crispus Attucks remained important. In the late 1880s, as the effort to preserve the memory of Attucks forever in Boston through the building of a monument, efforts that were begun by Nell more than 3 decades earlier, finally started to make headway, fears over this social realignment and the simmering racism beneath it boiled over, with critical opposition to the building of an Attucks monument. It was in this conflict that John Adams's false portrait of Attucks as a violent brute returned. One white historian from the Massachusetts Historical Society opined that, quote, "the martyr's crown is placed upon the brow of the vulgar ruffian," end quote, and suggested that legislators who approved the monument had been convinced to do so more by, quote, "Negroes and the cheaper politicians than by educated men," end quote. A newspaper editorial at the time suggested that, quote, "it is time that the sentimental falsehood that he was the first or any sort of martyr to the cause of American freedom was exploded," end quote, and instead tried to replace the sentiment with the falsehood that, quote, "Attucks and the cruel, bloodthirsty mob of which he was acting as leader were engaged in an entirely unprovoked and wanton attack upon a handful of peaceful British soldiers," end quote. To be clear, whatever view one might take today of the intentions or righteousness of the crowd of protesters that day, to single out Crispus Attucks as its leader and himself specifically as causing the violence unprovoked is not only insupportable, but racist. And to accept the Boston Massacre as a watershed moment in American independence and liberty and its victims as martyrs, but to refuse to accept Attucks specifically as a martyr of liberty is also just totally racist and hypocritical. This was, I think, recognized at the time, as in 1888 the monument was built, a granite obelisk with a bronze relief of the massacre on its base and 13 stars at its top, and a sculpture before it representing the spirit of revolution. And at its dedication, Boston's mayor emphasized that the monument was intended to confirm, quote, "the words of that declaration that all men are free and equal, without regard to color, creed, or nationality," end quote. Following the building of his memorial, Crispus Attucks once again faded into the background of history, but this time his memory was kept alive in the writings of African Americans who named places and organizations after him, and, eager to preserve his memory, swung perhaps too far in the opposite direction, embellishing his story to glorify and idealize him. During this time, Crispus Attucks became not just a freedom fighter, but a great orator, said to have delivered inspiring speeches. He became not just a metaphorical Black founding father, but a literal one. Stories were told that he had been a member of the Sons of Liberty, alongside Samuel Adams and John Hancock, which would certainly have been strange, since in their speeches commemorating the massacre, they said nothing much about him, and usually didn't even mention his name. It was claimed that he had been close friends with that other Son of Liberty, Paul Revere, who had strangely omitted any clear representation of Attucks from his version of the massacre scene engraving. In retrospect, these celebrators of Attucks's memory even claimed that John Adams had quote-unquote eulogized him and his quote-unquote glorious martyrdom, which we have seen is the opposite of the truth. Some even felt it necessary to suggest that George Washington had spoken admiringly of him and claimed that Thomas Jefferson once said, quote, "The blood of Crispus Attucks nourished the tree of liberty," end quote, which is entirely a fabrication. It was not until the 1920s and 30s, as the academic study of African American history developed into a true scholarly discipline, that the reality of his memory was reclaimed, especially by Carter Woodson, the journalist and historian who founded the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Woodson rejected such false distortions of the historical record and nevertheless championed the view that Attucks had been a patriot and martyr to the revolutionary cause. He may have given too much credence to accounts from the trial, versions of the events that were actually designed to villainize and scapegoat Attucks, but he nevertheless was the first to do any serious scholarship on Attucks since Nell resurrected his memory. To protests that Attucks's contributions could not be counted alongside those of other patriots because of his low background, he turned the argument around on the most celebrated of patriots, pointing out that Washington, quote, came from the lowest ranks, end quote, and calling Jefferson, quote, a poor uplander, end quote, and Patrick Henry, quote, a ragamuffin failure, end quote. Having evaluated all the evidence of Attucks's blackness as collected by William Cooper Nell, he bristled when other journalists dug up the old doubts about Attucks's race, calling them the, quote, Bureau of Misinformation, end quote, and asserting that they were trying to, quote, Caucasianize him in some way or make him the hero of some other race, for it will never do to let it be said that he was a man of Negro blood, end quote. With certainty, he pointed out that, quote, if living in this country today, Attucks would be subjected to all the inconveniences and insults that people of his race now encounter, end quote. And the callous hypocrisy of white America's casting of doubt on Crispus Attucks's blackness is revealed in the fact that within less than 10 years, the memory of Crispus Attucks was gleefully touted by the U.S. government in an effort to recruit black soldiers to fight in World War II. Suddenly vanished were the questions of whether he was indeed black, and gone the questions of whether he had indeed been a patriot, as soon as he came to be seen as a useful propaganda tool. Don't think about your plight in America, they said. Be like Crispus Attucks, fight for freedom and country, and this will earn you the respect you've been denied. This message was not only spread by government propagandists, though, it was also championed by black writers and other advocates for racial equality, who often compared Dory Miller, the black sailor who bravely manned an anti-aircraft gun during the attack on Pearl Harbor, to that first black fighter of America's battles, Crispus Attucks. In this way, they celebrated the heroism and wartime contributions of African American soldiers and simultaneously strengthened their demands for inclusion and equality at home. Thus, the memory of Crispus Attucks, American martyr and hero, became somewhat settled because it appealed to those on all sides. The final chapter in the saga of conflict over the memory of Crispus Attucks came in the Civil Rights era, when black leaders wrestled with the complicated history of this figure and the different uses to which his memory had been put. It's unsurprising that Crispus Attucks would become a topic of debate again during this time, when, like the heyday of his first resurgence in the 1850s, he became a popular historical figure to reference in speeches made by activists like Jackie Robinson and Jesse Jackson, who lauded him as a black American hero. Also unsurprising is the fact that, in opposition to this celebration, negative characterizations of the figure would likewise reemerge, such as when Stanford historian Thomas Bailey whined about, quote, significant white men being bumped out to make room for much less significant black men in the interests of social harmony, end quote. But what's perhaps more telling are the views of Attucks taken by other civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. eschewed the traditional hero worship, and instead, in his book Why We Can't Wait, emphasizes the undeniable truth that Black stories are excluded from history books, and points out the hypocrisy that a great-great-grandson of Attucks, who, as his ancestor is praised by Black and white alike for having done, might have served his country in war as a U.S. Marine, would be stopped at the door of a whites-only restaurant under Jim Crow. Certainly, this is the most undeniable and powerful argument to invoke Crispus Attucks. But perhaps even more powerful and thought-provoking today is the complicated view of Attucks taken by Black Power activist Kwame Ture, who had been a freedom rider and leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under his former name, Stokely Carmichael. Like others before him, Kwame Ture justifiably took the dim view of Attucks being a quote-unquote fool because he had, quote, died for white folk country while the rest of his Black brothers were enslaved in this country. He should have been fighting white folk instead of dying for white folk, end quote. This was not a new opinion. Even decades earlier, Carter Woodson complained of the view that Attucks was a fool because he had, quote, sacrificed his life for a country which held his people as slaves, end quote. A view Woodson rejected. But, of course, Kwame Ture had seen enough violent racism and mistreatment of Black Americans to thoroughly justify his views. In fact, it disillusioned him enough that he began to see nonviolent demonstration as ineffective, and the Black Power movement he popularized turned more toward resistance and rebellion. In this cause, Kwame Ture found reason to hold up Crispus Attucks again as a model. He suggested that those in the modern day who rise up in physical rebellion against the white police state and government-sanctioned violence are acting in the historic tradition of Crispus Attucks. And it's this particular symbolism that has continued to strike a chord in the Black community, following the police slayings of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice in 2014, Walter Scott in 2015, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile in 2016, Stephon Clark in 2018, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in 2020, Dante Wright in 2021, Patrick Lyoya and Jayland Walker in 2022, Ricky Cobb in 2023, and so many others who go unnamed and little remarked by the nation at large. Therefore, it's completely understandable now that as state-sanctioned violence is perpetrated against white Americans, their Black compatriots remind them that the political repression and racialist violence of fascism is nothing new in the United States. It's just harder to deny its existence when it's visited upon your own. And today, the symbolism provided by the Boston Massacre of white and Black and indigenous Americans standing together against oppressive military occupation and violence in the streets, of a diverse coalition of fellow countrymen standing together against the guns of jackbooted bullies who like wearing red, and their willingness to spill blood as a catalyst for revolutionary change, is more powerful and relevant than ever. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Check out my principal source for this episode, Mitch Kashoon's first Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I remain behind on patron fulfillment. I appear to be locked out of my publishing platform, so ordering new copies of my novel is proving difficult. I'm troubleshooting. Thank you all for your continued support. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember the old maxim, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. As is often the case, this saying was falsely attributed to Mark Twain in 1970 by a poet, and this misattribution has stuck ever since. One humorist in 1896, however, did state something similar, which bears repeating. Quote, "History does not repeat itself, the historians repeat one another," end quote. And no matter how much we repeat ourselves, few seem to listen.